Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, I'm joined by Paul D.B. Watkins, professor of English at Vancouver Island University. Paul is the author of Soundin, Canaan, Black Canadian Poetry, Music, and Citizenship, a uniquely researched and presented monograph that, while distinguishing aesthetics from rhetoric, traces a line from Black Canadian poetry through music to describe Black Canadian life, experience, and citizenship. A DJ himself, Paul mirrors the remixing and sampling methods used by musicians to enhance his research with samples of poetry, literature, interviews, and cultural elements, and even an accompanying playlist, to more deeply portray Black life in Canada. The title is published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. Before we get started, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. In this third episode of our series, we look at how Paul's book addresses the meanings of citizenship, including the idea of sonic citizenship, and how that relates to the many ways music can be sampled and mixed. So you use the word sounded in various forms to describe certain concepts. It shows up most prominently in the title of the book. You also describe citizenship as sounded. You introduce the overture as a resounding of the past. Can you talk about how you're using that word and how it conveys special meanings?
Sure. I think of poetry making, poesis, right, as an act of citizenship. And by that, I don't just mean, the passport sense of citizenship any more than
Right.
multiculturalism should mean government policy.
Mm-hmm.
And, the poets in the book do this border crossing practice as a way of claiming space and belonging. So, George Eliot Clark gets at this beautifully when he writes, "You've heard Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, you need no passports," right? Wade Compton also does a similar thing in a poem about Fujianese migrants who arrived in Canada in 1999, actually in Esquimalt, right, Vancouver Island. And he points out the gap between Canada's self-image as welcoming and the way those migrants were actually treated, right? Asking, why is it vilifiable now for these migrants to hide, right, in the belly of a dream? So both of them are modeling, what I use in the book as sonic citizenship, a way of thinking about identity and belonging through sound, not just through state definition. So sound works in a lot of registers. It's the music, it's the performance of the poems, it's the soundtrack, but it's also a more engaged way of being a citizen, right? So the book opens talking about Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On."
Mm-hmm.
And Nelson Mandela talked about how much strength he drew from that album while in prison, relating the U.S. civil rights struggle to his own fight against apartheid. And "What's Going On" still hits sonically, right? You can put it on and it's just smooth, beautiful music. I think you can appreciate it just on that sort of like aesthetic register. But
Sure.
underneath, there's a rhetorical weight to it, right? The lyrics demand we confront hatred, suffering, and injustice. And that's the tension I'm trying to get at. How something can sound good and also carry the force of political urgency. And I guess my hope is that readers who pick up the book, especially non-Black readers, can not just understand, but actually hear that form of citizenship. Right, to listen to the ways these poets are resounding history, and to feel how sound itself can be an act that creates belonging, memory, and resistance.
Yeah, excellent. I'm curious if you've talked to anybody, in the sense of using Marvin Gaye as "What's Going On" as an example. The music is so amazing, and the lyrics underneath it are so meaningful. Oftentimes, people don't put those two together; like they're attracted to one or the other. And I'm wondering, in the process of writing this book or just talking to people in general, if that comes up where people may just kind of pay attention to the music and they're not even aware or cluing into what's being said underneath that music.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not trying to be overly prescriptive, like saying like it's a great failing if you don't sort of get all the rhetorical connotations. I know sometimes people just listen to music, because they want something aesthetically out of it, and I think that's fine. Like, there's sometimes still politics at work you might not be aware of. Even like dance, music without lyrics, it still carries meaning. Even the act of like dancing in concert with other people, right? I think that's political in a sense because you're building community, right. in that space, in a temporal space. So,
or jazz,
it's the same. Jazz. Or if you listen to Handel's Messiah, like even if you're not religious, maybe you're not moved to like God's like grandeur or something like that, but you still get something out of the piece that moves you in maybe in a different way. And sometimes I think like that rhetorical thing, it might hit you at another time, later down the road, and that's totally fine as well. The thing I'm trying to do here is just to help, readers build an appreciation to sort of see both registers and to sort of just move away from seeing them as like separate registers, because I think for the poets in this book and a lot of the musicians, those things are part and parcel. They're connected that way.
Yeah, exactly. In a similar sense, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you've adapted Vincent Andressani's concept of quote sonic citizenship. You just mentioned it a little bit earlier. What does he mean by that, and how are you extending that in particular into your concepts of citizenship and multiculturalism in your book?
Yeah, so it was a term I had come up with and was really proud of. And then you go to the internet and you're like, oh, someone else is actually using this term. So as you mentioned, the term sonic citizenship, it comes from Vincent Andressani. And thankfully, he was using it in a way that actually really deepened the way that I wanted to use it. So I was, pretty happy to actually find how he was using it, because it actually gave me some more critical language. So he explores the role of Soundin, Havana. He highlights the enduring presence of ice cream vendors whose sounds connect the city spaces despite shifting historical and political contexts. So similarity, I argue that listening to the poets in Soundin Canaan, right, closely listening to the poems, the sounds, the musical samples they incorporate, this also constitutes an act of sonic citizenship, right? It's an immersive practice of reading and listening, and engages with how citizens navigate and inhabit life in Canada. Right? It underscores the ways in which cultural identity and inclusion are negotiated beyond the framework of the legal state. So while a truly egalitarian, multicultural Canada is largely myth, right, reflected particularly through the lived experiences of Black and Indigenous folk, I think it's also a malleable myth, with parts reworking. So I also talk about sonic multiculturalism, right? And especially as countries like the United States, France, Germany, and Britain, right, turn to nationalism, often saying, multiculturalism is dead, labeling it as an utter failure, right? And that we need to return to traditional American, French, German, English, or, even Canadian values, right? Canada's hardly immune. Right. Earlier this year, there was an interview between Pierre Poilievre and Jordan Peterson, and they critiqued multiculturalism in Canada. They rejected the concept of the hyphenated identity. At one point, they even claimed that wokeism was something that was imported into Canada. Right. Read a history book.
Yeah.
And so once again, right, I think it's this thing that has to be active, while also being aware that some of these terms are pretty slippery, dependent on, who's using them and how they're being used.
Yeah. I'm wondering, though, too, if, the idea of sonic citizenship, music can sometimes be very regional, too. In terms of even lyrically, sort of representing a certain sense of place. I'm thinking like in the States, East Coast, West Coast, hip hop, Southern hip hop, and just sort of the act of honoring, where you come from and your neighborhoods as well. And I guess, the idea of citizenship, if you could talk a little bit about how the idea of that relates to the way music itself can be remixed, chopped, or sampled.
Yeah, and I think we can take perhaps another musical angle for that. So in terms of hip hop, right, thinking of something that's, pretty regional, starting out in New York and then, of course, spread across the planet, right?
Yeah, right.
The form has always struck me as profoundly democratic. Of course, it's become part of mass culture, but, sort of at its roots, it emerges right from communities historically pushed to the margins, yet it creates shared space in real time. So I think it's, a modeling of sonic citizenship. Also, if we look at the DJ once again, right, they pull samples across genres, eras, and geographies, layering them into something once dissonant yet cohesive. So in that act of stitching together difference, hip hop models, a kind of multiculturalism. So in an ideal sense, Canada aspires to be this kind of space, a place where different cultures and traditions rub up against one another, almost like different samples, to produce something vital, unexpected, collective. Of course, the reality is much more complicated, right? We often fall short of this ideal, which is why I draw on Cecil Foster's notion of comedy and tragedy, right, in relation to multiculturalism. The comedy being those joyful moments of collaboration and creativity, the tragedy being the persistence of inequality and exclusion. So hip hop, with its capacity to hold contradiction and to transform into art, gives us a way, I think, to think through and feel both sides of that equation. One chapter I look at the work of hip hop artist Canaan, and his music samples in really eclectic ways, right? To sort of speak to his own hybrid identity. So born in Somalia, Canaan often reflects his experience growing up in Mogadishu, but he also grapples with life in Canada, particularly in Rexdale, Toronto. So he pulls from Africa artists such as Ethiopian musician Mulatu Astake, as well as global voices like Bob Marley. And so through this blending, he connects the local struggle of identity, citizenship status, gang violence with questions of global injustice, addressing his brethren and sisterin, in Somalia, but also Africa, right, and beyond, and in Toronto. And his most popular song, Waving Flag, if anybody knows any of his music, that was just such a big hit, right? Because it was, adopted by FIFA in 2010. But this also makes it particularly vivid, I think, right? It began as something personal. And then once he sort of released it into the world, it produced all sorts of remixes. And I talk about these remixes. One of them I describe as sort of like state sponsored and corporate sponsored, like multiculturalism, right? There's like a version created by Coca-Cola. There's also these other like remix versions, one including 50 Canadian musicians. And so, Canaan explains himself, right, that in a Somali tradition, once a song is shared publicly, it no longer belongs to the artist, it belongs to the community. So I think this principle mirrors an ideal of citizenship, right? It's something that's active, collective. It's fluid rather than possessive. And I try to think that in terms of criticism as well. And its best form functions this way too. So, I believe poetry carries the same kind of power as hip hop. It's a way to model more inclusive understandings of citizenship, multiculturalism, community. And, the poets are sort of modeling this form of citizenship through their own sampling, their own recontextualization. And then as a critic, I'm trying to do the same.
You just heard from Paul D.B. Watkins. Paul is a professor of English at Vancouver Island University and the author of Soundin, Canaan, Black Canadian Poetry, Music, and Citizenship, available now through Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. Join us next week as Paul talks about the design of his book and how its layout and physical presentation facilitate and support the concepts it covers. Remember, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. The Authority File podcast is brought to you every week by a small but extraordinary team, including Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, digital media producer Sabrina Kofer, and digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.